As we saw in our intro lecture, there was a lot going on all over the world in 1215. From the Americas to Asia to the Middle East, that year was certainly an important one in world history. Today, however, we're going to circle back to the European medieval world, and we're going to start talking about an event that, when it occurred, was actually totally unimportant. Not only that, but we're going to spend 3 whole lectures on what was, at the time, a non-event event, the creation of the Magna Carta. So you might be wondering, why are we going to spend so much time talking about something that went practically unnoticed by the entire rest of the world at that time? And you might also be thinking, okay, wait a minute, I've heard of the Magna Carta. Isn't that the document that serves as the basis for English common law and in turn, arguably the entire legal system of the United States of America? Didn't it serve as inspiration for those who fought during the French Revolution? Isn't that the document that inspired some of the most important clauses of the United Nations Charter as it exists today? Yes, it is. But when King John of England affixed his seal to the charter in June of the year 1215 at a field called Runnymede, just outside London, just about the only people who cared what was happening were King John and the 25 aggrieved English noblemen who had essentially forced him to accept their demands. The creation of Magna Carta was not intended as a blow struck for justice for the common man. It was a document prepared by a group of rich, white, upper-class men who wanted to stay that way. The clauses that today are interpreted as a rallying cry for justice, freedom, and equality, those were written with the intention of protecting the interests of English nobles. In fact, if you read carefully through all 63 clauses, which we're going to be doing in the next lecture, and I promise it's much more exciting than it sounds, you'll discover that the Magna Carta is a rather strange document that is at times incredibly vague and at others startlingly specific. For example, the clause that often gets cited as establishing the right to a fair and speedy trial simply says that justice may not be sold or delayed. It doesn't bother to explain what might constitute a delay, a week, a month, a year, nor does it explain what the going rate for selling justice might be. That's been left for later courts and societies to figure out on their own. But other clauses give guidance on things like how much money the king could ask his subjects for in taxes to pay for his daughter's wedding. Also, there's a clause that is very concerned about there being too many fish weirs or fish traps in the Thames River, because this was causing damage to many of the boats on the river. It's one of the things I love about this document, the occasionally bizarre juxtaposition of the grand rallying cry for equality, justice for all, followed by, and stop putting wooden fish traps in the Thames because we can't always see them, and then I have to fix the bottom of my boat. It is what happened after the creation of the document, and in fact, quite a long time after, that transformed the Magna Carta into a document that is often considered on par with the laws of Hammurabi or the Code of Justinian in terms of establishing and affirming laws, rights, justice, and order. We'll talk about the events of the aftermath of that June day in 1215 2 lectures from now. But today, we need to understand some background and how it was that the Magna Carta came to be in the first place. And to do that, I'm going to have to give a ridiculously compressed and simplified history of the medieval European West, particularly England, in the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, what you have to remember is that what we think of as England today looked very different especially at the end of the 1100s. If we go back a bit further, you may remember that in 1066, William the Conqueror had sailed across the English Channel, made good his claim to the English throne by defeating Harold Godwinson's army at the Battle of Hastings, and almost overnight completely dissolved and recreated the upper class of society in England. Anglo-Saxon lords either died, had their lands seized, or they entered monasteries, and all those lands and titles were given by William to his loyal followers from Normandy. The upper class of English society was now, for all intents and purposes, French, speaking and writing a language that we today call Anglo-Norman. England was now not only most of the Isle of Britain, it was also a large chunk of what we think of today as France. The Normans had themselves been vassals of the French king, but suddenly all this territory claimed by the Normans arguably made them much more powerful and wealthy than the French crown, even though, technically speaking, a duke, like William of Normandy, could not, by definition, be more powerful than the lord to whom he owed obeisance. This was going to become a sticking point later on. Was the King of England a vassal of the King of France? How could it be that one king should do homage to another for lands and titles? This conundrum would play an important role in the events leading up to June 1215. Okay, but skipping ahead a bit, William the Conqueror's heirs continued to increase their territorial holdings, with the greatest expansion of lands coming under the rule of King Henry II. This Henry was the son of William the Conqueror's granddaughter, Matilda. In 1152, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, heiress to the great continental duchy of Aquitaine in what is today France. Now, Aquitaine was a huge territory, which greatly expanded England's power, wealth, and status when Eleanor brought it with her when she married Henry. But there's an added rub to this. Prior to marrying Henry, Eleanor had been married to the French king, Louis VII. Although their marriage had produced 2 daughters, it was apparently not a happy one, and eventually, for reasons that are way too complex to go into here, the marriage was annulled, leaving Eleanor free to remarry, which she did, and when she did, she took her big old Duchy of Aquitaine with her. Henry became King of England 2 years after they married, and he proceeded to try and both shore up and expand his territorial holdings. The name that we give to this territory today is the Angevin Empire. The word Angevin here is a reference to the fact that Henry II's father was the Count of Anjou, but it probably wasn't called that at the time. Henry himself referred to all these territories in terms like, quote, our kingdom and everything subject to our rule, whatever it may be. At its height, whatever it may be included England, Ireland, Brittany, Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Gascony, Poitou, Nantes, and I'm running out of breath here, and the list is not even complete. So that's arguably the moment when English holdings are at their apex. It was so much that Henry planned to divide it up into chunks for his sons, as far as he could. And he and Eleanor had many sons. The first one died in infancy. To Henry, the second son, known as the Young King, would go England, Normandy, and some other territories across the Channel. Richard, who was son number 3, was going to get Aquitaine. Geoffrey, son number 4, was married off to the heiress of Brittany, so he was taken care of. But son number 5, John, looked to be out of luck. Indeed, one of his early names was Lackland, because it didn't seem there would be much to inherit or any politically advantageous marriages left to be made once they got to John. This may be one reason why Henry II wanted to add Ireland to his holdings. He could give Ireland to John. Those of you who know your history know that the nickname Lackland was going to turn out to be ironic. Henry the young king, frustrated that he had nothing to do during his actual lifetime, rebelled against his father. Later, he died of dysentery, not a pleasant way to go, while engaged in a campaign in France. With the death of Henry the young king, who never actually got to be king, this meant that Richard was now going to inherit not only Aquitaine, but pretty much all the rest of the Angevin Empire. And like his older brother Henry, Richard also at one point rebelled against his father. Even more interestingly, he formed an alliance with King Philip II of France, who was, wait for it, the son of his mother's ex-husband. If you're getting confused by all of these familial shenanigans, you're not alone, don't worry. But just to add to this messy picture, Eleanor herself was put under house arrest for a time by her husband, Henry II, for conspiring with their sons against him. Again, don't worry if you don't have all the details. If you take anything away from all this information, it should simply be stuff between France and England is really messy and confusing. Finally, Richard becomes king of pretty much everything that is the Angevin Empire. Alas, Richard was not as interested in being king, and in particular, not as interested in producing an heir, as he was always busy fighting and crusading. He spent almost his entire reign outside England, either crusading or being held for ransom by Duke Leopold of Austria and various other leaders he'd managed to antagonize. That's another good story, but one we don't have time for now. When Richard died in 1199 with no legitimate heirs, guess who became king? That's right, John, also known as Lackland. John apparently was plagued by a combination of bad luck and abysmal military strategy. Almost as soon as he became king, everything that had made the English crown such a force and a power began to disintegrate. In a series of very expensive continental conflicts early in his reign, and remember, France and England are always fighting over something somewhere at this time, he lost almost all the English lands across the Channel. At the same time that he was fighting in France, he was also waging wars in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, so the royal treasury was stretched a bit thin, a situation that led him to levy increasingly burdensome taxes on the people of England. In fact, the loss of the English lands in France was a double whammy, not only because the cost of trying to defend those lands from King Philip Augustus of France was excessive, but also when they were lost, the crown lost any revenue in the form of rents or other compensation that those lands had traditionally brought to the crown. So John tried to squeeze as much money out of official sources of royal revenue back home, particularly from royal office holders, from the justice system, and by abusing the system of feudal land tenure. I should back up here to say a little bit about how the crown received income in the Middle Ages. It used a system that is often called feudalism. Now, although this term is somewhat in disrepute these days among scholars, the idea that it embodies a system of loyalty and service that is hierarchical is still the right way to think of relationships among king and subjects in the 13th century. In the feudal system, all land in the kingdom is theoretically held in fee from the king. He grants lands to the nobles just below him in rank, and they become his vassals in return for their service, usually in battle and the payment of annual rents. And so it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Those nobles then divvy up and enfeoff or grant their lands to subtenants, who in turn owe some combination of service, days of labor to help the Lord bring in his crops, for example, and maybe some type of rent, usually in the form of goods like livestock or a certain percentage of the subtenant's own harvested crops. And then you repeat this so on down the line until you reach the peasants at the foot of the hierarchical pyramid, who were really subsistence farmers who were considered unfree or serfs, meaning they were bound to the lands of the Lord for whom they told. John angered the barons at the top of the pyramid by demanding increased fee payments, a cost that the barons would then have to pass on to their tenants, and so on. John also leaned on sheriffs, who were officials appointed to oversee a large portion of the crown's lands. Those appointed to this office were in a position to accrue substantial benefit for themselves, and thus were expected to pay to the king an annual fee for the right to hold office. In addition to the rents they were in charge of collecting from tenants on the crown's lands. The annual payment was known as a farm, and John upset the sheriffs by increasing the amount of the farm. So far, John is not endearing himself to anyone. But there's more. He worked the justice system as well. Bribery was common here, as litigants often offered great sums of money to the court in hope of a favorable decision. John also worked the rules surrounding royal forests. Until 1066 and the Norman invasion, any person living in England could go out in the forest and hunt for deer or boar or other animals to feed one's family. With the arrival of William the Conqueror, all of this changed. Those lands decreed royal forests were subject now to all sorts of rules. Reserved for the king's hunt, there were serious fines for encroaching or poaching. John afforested more lands than were traditionally exclusive property of the crown. And when the inevitable infringements took place, the crown then racked up a substantial amount of money in fines. Added to the monetary woes was the fact that John placed England in a position of spiritual crisis, which really did not help his popularity any. Remember that at this time, England was Catholic. We are centuries before the Protestant Reformation that would sweep through Europe and during which King Henry VIII would split from the Catholic Church so that he could put aside his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn. So that's centuries later. Right now, when John came to the throne in 1199, Pope Innocent III had just been raised to the papacy. The Pope would be both enemy and ally to John in the years ahead. But things got ugly in 1205 when the Archbishop of Canterbury died. Almost immediately, John got into a conflict with the monks at Canterbury and the Pope as to who had the final say on the appointment of the Archbishop, a struggle over the rights of the crown versus the rights of the church, which he should have known better how to negotiate given his own father's experience. You might remember that John's father, Henry II, had appointed Thomas Becket, who was also his good friend and Chancellor of England, Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry thought that this was very clever, as he would now have power both secular and spiritual. What's interesting is that Becket told him not to do it, because he would be compelled, he said, to put the needs of the church ahead of any demands of the king. Henry apparently didn't believe him, and in 1170, when Becket resisted Henry's attempt to bend his will, Henry is reported to have shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights who were in attendance at that moment heard this, and they seemed to have taken it as a suggestion. And they went to Canterbury, and they struck Becket down and murdered him in Canterbury Cathedral itself. Henry claimed that he had never intended for this to happen, and he did public penance to show just how sorry he was. But again, what we should remember here is relationships between the crown and the Archbishop of Canterbury, not so good. John apparently hadn't learned the lesson. His father finally had. And John insisted that the crown had the power to install the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, the Pope's choice was Cardinal Stephen Langton, and the monks confirmed him as Archbishop in 1206. The Pope consecrated him in 1207. In response, John refused to let Langton enter England, and then he kicked all the monks out of Canterbury. The Pope's answer to this temper tantrum was to put all of England under what was called interdict. From 1208 to 1213, church bells did not ring in England. Mass was not celebrated. People who died could not be buried in holy ground. As you can imagine, this was fairly upsetting for the majority of the English populace who were devout, practicing Christians. In retaliation for this, John seized the lands and revenues of the church in England for himself, which got him excommunicated by the Pope. So, things, to put it mildly, are not going well for John. He had lost almost all the Duchy of Normandy by 1204. And in 1212, not only had he been excommunicated and his country put under interdict by the Pope, but he also was facing the threat of an invasion of England by the French King Philip Augustus. So finally, in 1213, John accepted Langton as archbishop and brought back and compensated the Canterbury clergy he had exiled. The most dramatic development to come out of this situation, however, was that in order to get back in the Pope's good graces, John had to accept the Pope's overlordship. In other words, he turned over what was left of the great Angevin Empire, by this point pretty much just Ireland and England, plus a few territories across the Channel. He turned these over to the papacy, but for an annual payment to Rome of 1,000 marks, he remained king. In essence, he became a feudal vassal of the Pope. The immediate effect of this was that the French king, Philip Augustus, who had been ready to invade England, reconsidered. He didn't want to make an enemy of the Pope, and the Pope became one of John's biggest supporters, a relationship John exploited immediately after he was forced to accept the Magna Carta, as we'll see. In 1214, John lost even more of the English lands in France, so that by the end of that year, the Angevin Empire, over which he had ruled, was reduced to just Poitou and Gascony on the continent. His attempts to defend these lands had led to ever greater increases in taxes and abuses of royal power, which provoked a group of barons to demand that John affirm the laws of the Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor and reissue the Charter of Liberties that Henry I had issued at his coronation. John refused, and the barons petitioned the Pope as feudal overlord of England. But the Pope was slow to make any decisive move here. On May 5th, 1215, after several attempts to arrange a meeting with John, a group of barons renounced their allegiance to the throne, in effect declaring civil war. There were some attempts to capture royal castles, and there were heated negotiations between people like Stephen Langton, who was in favor of reform, and staunch royalist supporter William Marshall, the first Earl of Pembroke. We can get a more specific idea as to what it was the barons were so upset about if we look at the document itself. We'll do this at much greater length in the next lecture, but we'll hit a few highlights here. Clause 2 of the Magna Carta establishes amounts that the regent was allowed to tax his subjects on specific occasions: for the making of his eldest son a knight, for going to war, for marrying off his eldest daughter, one time. John had been trying to up what is essentially a death tax. For example, he required nobleman Roger de Lacy to pay £4,500 to succeed to his father's lands, a huge sum of money. He demanded £6,666 from Nicholas de Stuteville before he would allow him to inherit his father's lands after his father's death. De Stuteville had to lease some estates, sell others, and surrender a couple to John as collateral for payment. Again, remember that these articles are of greatest import to wealthy landed nobles with estates and treasure. Clauses 3 through 6 deal with minor heirs. John was selling rights of wardship over young orphaned heirs and heiresses to the highest bidder. people who often ruined the inheritance for the ward when he came of age, either by exploiting the estates for their own gain, failing to maintain them, or both. Also, the king had the right to give heirs in marriage, again, to the highest bidder, and often against the wishes of the immediate family. Clauses 7 through 8 deal with widows. John was also arranging marriages for widows who might have come into profitable estates. Very often, these arranged marriages went against the will of the widows. There were plenty of nobles eager to increase their lands and wealth by marrying wealthy widows, but it is safe to say that in many instances, the widows were perfectly happy to go on being widows. Thank you very much. Pressure from the king, who received a payment from all those grateful men he married off, meant that many widows were essentially compelled to remarry when they did not wish to. Clause 12 deals with the issue of scutage. This was the term for what feudal tenants owed the king instead of military service. Instead of days of service, cash was preferred, but there was no hard and fast rule about when such a tax could be levied. John levied 11 scutages in his 17 years on the throne. His father, King Henry II, only levied 8 in 34 years. The Magna Carta established 3 situations in which the king could do this without baronial consent. Finally, on June 10, 1215, the disgruntled barons met with John's representatives at Runnymede, where they held negotiations that resulted in a document called the Articles of the Barons. And this contained 49 articles and was probably the rough draft of the Magna Carta. On June 15, 1215, John sealed the document we now call Magna Carta. This document contained 63 clauses, and on June 19th, the barons renewed their allegiance to him. Several copies were made of the charter, and it was circulated throughout the land. Only 4 of the originals survive today, 2 in the British Library, 1 in Lincoln Cathedral, and 1 in Salisbury Cathedral. It seems John never intended to adhere to the articles in the charter, and on August 24, 1215, at a request from John, the Pope declared the Magna Carta to be unlawful, unjust, base, and shameful. Because when John agreed to accept the articles in 1215, he certainly did not do so willingly, and immediately upon giving his formal agreement, he appealed to the Pope to declare the document null and void, unenforceable, and without significance. Now, with an even stronger vested interest in England and not wanting to dilute any of his newly won authority, Pope Innocent III was happy to issue a papal bull declaring that the Magna Carta was as unlawful and unjust as it is base and shameful, whereby the Apostolic See is brought into contempt, the royal prerogative diminished, the English outraged, and the whole enterprise of the crusade gravely imperiled. This decree came down from the Pope in August of 1215, meaning that Magna Carta had lasted less than 3 months. Within a few months of this, England became embroiled in a civil war much worse than the one the Magna Carta had been designed to try and avert. Archbishop Langton had the royal castle of Rochester in his keeping, and John demanded he surrender it. Langton refused, and it was handed over to the rebel barons. John besieged the castle for 7 weeks until it was recaptured, but there would be a series of rebellions throughout England in the months after this. Things got so bad that some of the rebel barons went to Louis, son of French King Philip Augustus, and they offered him the throne of England. Remember when I said that things between France and England were messy? Philip thought that this was not a good idea, but Louis went across the channel anyway, and by summer 1216, 2/3 of the barons had gone over to Louis's side, recognizing him as king. Shortly after this, though, disputes flared up between Louis's French company and the native English rebels. I know, the French and English not getting along, what a surprise. And the French cause, because of this, lost most of its support. John then went on the offensive, trying to quash various pockets of rebellion throughout the country. But the last few months of his reign were dismal. He contracted dysentery, and several cartloads of treasure were lost in the crossing of the marshy wetlands known as the Wash in the northwest corner of East Anglia. John died suddenly of dysentery in mid-October, and at his request was buried in Worcester Cathedral. So clearly, Magna Carta is the great charter that was almost a footnote to history. In our next lecture, we're going to dive deeper into the document itself, exploring its clauses in depth and discussing how they reflect the barons' concerns with their king. And in the lecture after that, we're going to see how it is that the Magna Carta survived